this webinar. My name is Stéphane Voisin. I'm a Director of Sustainable Finance at Institut Louis Bachelier, and I have the pleasure to moderate this session today. I'm also the Director of PARC. You can see the acronym of PARC, the foundation that shelters at all ILB Sustainable Finance Research. PARC stands for Paris Agreement Research Commons. Our mission is simple. We produce research that stands behind the Paris Agreement. And yes, as you can hear me, we are based in Paris, and we're not going anywhere until its goals are met. First, I'd like to thank our sponsor that support us on this project. This is ADEME and Climate Arc, and also the people that have worked on it, Adrien, Nestor, Peter, and the dozens of reviewers, and of course, Julie, that will present the report. Of course, I also would like to thank our speakers today. So we have an outstanding lineup of experts representing various institutional initiatives that plays a key role in advancing the topic of consolidated individual climate alignment at a collective level. Joining us are Simon Messenger from the NZBA, Valerio Michale from CPI, Climate Policy Initiative, Raphael Jashnik, who leads the the Finance for Climate Action team at the OECD. And we're also thrilled to have Sagarika Chatterjee, who leads or heads the UN high-level Champions Climate Finance team. And last but certainly not, as I already said, Julie Reynaud is an ILB research fellow, an independent expert as well. She will kick the session off by presenting the report, the final outcome of a long-term research project called CAPA, which stands for Consolidated Alignment Performance Analytic. The report that Julie will present in a few seconds builds upon both the 2020 and the 2024 climate alignment cookbook, but advances the field in a few key ways that Julie will present. At the start, our common dream with Julie was to create a new standard methodology, one that could bring together all sorts of alignment metrics at an individual financial institution level and roll them up into a single consolidated quantitative value by type of financial players or by asset class or by regions. Our ultimate fantasy actually was a global one. It was to offer the Paris Agreement an elegant equation, something that could finally answer the key question at the heart of Article 2C. Tell me how aligned is finance with my goals. Of course, we came back down to earth fairly quickly with Julie and the team, but as it is often the case, we've realized that the road to an impossible outcome can be as interesting as the outcome itself. Julie, the floor is yours to present the report.
Thank you very much, Stéphane. Hi, everyone. So I'm Julie, and as mentioned, I will give you a quick tour of our newly published report called The Finance Sector's Path to the Global Climate Goals. So the field of climate alignment assessment is dynamic and expanding rapidly. A significant growing body of research is dedicated to evaluating alignment at the level of non-financial and financial entities, as well as their portfolios. For example, the Alignment Cookbook series and many other research from other institutions, such as the OECD, offered a comprehensive review of existing approaches across these crucial levels. However, the assessment of alignment at more consolidated levels, that is, extending beyond the individual financial entities to encompass groups of financial institutions, remains a largely uncharted territory. While a few pioneering organizations are beginning to explore this complex area, their estimates often concentrate on specific aspects, such as participation in net zero initiatives or the financing of climate solutions. In addition, while assessments exist across various levels, critical linkages between those levels are often missing. So this newly published report seeks to contribute to this increasingly important discussion. So on the next slide, you can see how we differentiate between different levels of analysis. So as I mentioned, the focus of this report is specifically on how to assess the consolidated alignment of a group of financial institutions, extending beyond individual financial entities and portfolios. And this differs from previous reports on alignment that looked at financial institution or portfolio levels. Next slide, please. So our comprehensive review of existing methodologies for assessing the alignment of financial institution groups led us to a core principle. Consolidated alignment assessments, in our view, must ultimately answer the fundamental question, who finances what for what outcome? So we propose that the alignment of a group of financial institutions is best understood through those three distinct yet complementary approaches, each designed to eliminate a specific facet of this overarching inquiry. So let's take 5 minutes to explore briefly each of these approaches, and of course you can find much more details in the report. So we begin with the WHO, the Financial Institution Transition Alignment family of approaches. These methodologies follow a clear two-step process. First, these methodologies assess the alignment of each individual institution within the researched group. Second, they aggregate the results of these individual assessments into a consolidated metric for the group. So the consolidated metrics, they will be typically expressed as a percentage. For example, the percentage of financial institutions within the assessed group with an adequate transition plan, signatory to a net zero initiative, or with a validated science-based target. Essentially, these approaches seek to answer the question, what proportion of the chosen group consists of aligned financial institutions? This family of approaches, of course, the most straightforward among those that we examined, which likely explains why it is the currently most common way to assess the consolidated alignment of a group of financial institutions. However, as I'm sure many of you know, the simplicity of this approach should not mask the important methodological questions it raises, such as how can we effectively gauge the robustness of a financial institution transition plan, and then what metric should we use to aggregate the results at the individual financial institution level, at the group level. So the report seeks to answer some of those questions. The second family of approaches that we reviewed, which refers to the what in the who finances what for what outcome, utilizes financing data at its foundation. The central idea of these approaches is that an aligned group of financial institutions effectively channels the necessary financing at the right speed and scale to the appropriate counterparties and activities, and away from those hindering climate goals. So financing alignment approaches, they seek to map and then aggregate climate-aligned financing flows at the consolidated level to produce aggregate estimates and compare them to financing and investment roadmaps. Of course, significant challenges persist, particularly in quantifying financial flows and stocks towards what we call credibly transitioning assets. These are financial assets that are inherently not climate solutions, nor incompatible, but that require transition and are necessary for the transition to happen. And defining these assets in particular and obtaining the consolidated data on the financing directed towards them remains key obstacles to implementing this type of approaches. And then finally, the last category, so the what outcome in the sentence, who finances what for what outcome. This final category of approaches utilizes the greenhouse gas emissions, the portfolio greenhouse gas emissions of financial institutions as input data. The underlying principle is that an aligned group of financial institutions demonstrates a decarbonization of its financed or facilitated emissions that follows the necessary pace and scale as outlined in transition scenarios and pathways. So this family of approaches directly addresses the core objective of climate-related financial efforts, that is, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So they take a two-step approach. First, they gather and then aggregate the portfolio emissions of individual institutions at the consolidated level, and then assess whether they collectively follow a specific decarbonization pathway. So these approaches, you will recognize them because they have been widely applied to assess portfolio level emissions for single financial institutions. But here, the idea is to apply them at the consolidated level. It, of course, introduces additional challenges, such as how to overcome the significant risk of double counting. In addition, we argue that these approaches are better suited for monitoring ex post emissions alignment. These are more accountability or lagging indicators. And careful attention must also be paid to distinguishing year-on-year emission changes resulting from real-world decarbonization versus methodological or data-related consequences. So this brings our concise review of approaches for assessing the alignment of financial institution groups to a close. You can find much more detail in the report, of course. So as a summary, based on our analysis, we believe that a robust framework for evaluating the alignment of a group of financial institutions must comprehensively address the three key aspects we've discussed, directly answering the question, who finances what for what outcome? And this requires a multifaceted approach that considers, number one, the quality of financial institutions' transition plans, strategies, and targets. Number two, the analysis of financing flows and stocks towards assets with different maturity levels in relation to the transition. And finally, number three, the ex post monitoring of real-world decarbonization resulting from these financial activities as an accountability measures. So thank you very much for your attention. And Stéphane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julie. We will take questions from the audience and online on the chat after I think every speakers has terminated. And I'd like very quickly, thank you, Julie, stay with us for the Q&A, please. To give the floor to Simon Messenger. Simon, you've been part of an organization that has been one of the very first to focus to shift the focus from individual FI's alignment effort to basically a collective effort. A lot of things have changed at the NZBA, and it's true from the NZAOA also, who has been first in that direction. Defense has been instrumental basically in providing the direction of travel. So we understand it's been recently a lot of change. Can you give us some highlight on these changes on the new NZBA guidance and a few basically word on the way forward?
Yeah, I'd be very, very happy to. There have been a few changes. At the same time, many things have stayed the same, and that's very much what I want to talk about today. So I will just share my screen. Only a few slides, but that way you can follow. So in terms of today, so basically that. So I want to provide a brief overview of the announcement, which happened about a month ago, which was about the outcome of a strategic review that the NZBA had been doing for, well, almost a year. And as a quick introduction, so I've been with the NZBA since it launched, and I currently head up its technical work. Before I talk about what the announcement was, I just want to provide maybe a quick backstory. And if we look back to 2020, which admittedly does seem like a lifetime ago, there was no NZBA. And in practice, there was very little target setting by financial institutions. This made sense as methodologies and practices, they were still emerging at that point. And effectively, in terms of banks, no banks had really set net zero targets. There were many institutions who were starting to work on it, but no actual net zero targets. At UNEP-FI, United Nations Environment Programme's Financial Initiative, there was a predecessor of the NZBA, which was called, and it's not very catchy, it was called the Collective Commitment on Climate Action, the CCCA. It was a bit of a deep dive group for the Principles for Responsible Banking banks for looking at climate. Then in April 2021, along with various other announcements, like GFANZ that Stefan just mentioned, the NZBA was launched at COP26 and had 43 members at the time. In all honesty, this was actually probably more than we thought we might get a few months prior when we started up the project, but it really showed the market's momentum, the desire for this alliance. And then we grew to the point where we peaked at around 140 plus members. And as you know, there have been a few departures in the last 5 months or so. We now have about 130 members, which represents almost 50 trillion US dollars in assets. But the market has also evolved during this time, as let's face it, in some regions, politics and policies, and this meant that the role of the alliance has naturally evolved. Whereas in 2021, as I mentioned, very few banks knew really where to start in terms of climate target setting. Now we have more than 100 of the members who have set their net zero targets. They're looking to implement, the actions to meet those targets. But as a whole, the capacity and the knowledge of the industry has increased massively over this time. But so what this means is that in the early days, the NZBA, it had a role in formalizing, structuring, developing a common approach which would allow comparability, transparency, and a common understanding of what is happening and what to focus on in terms of target setting. Now, however, and I'm not going to suggest that every bank knows perfectly how to set targets. Of course not. There's a lot of nuances in terms of like sectors, regions, and just technical knowledge. There's still a lot of gaps which are there. But as I said, 100 have set them, and therefore the need of the members and the value of the alliance evolves. And to reflect practical realities and real economy progress, the alliance spent most of 2024 and early 2025 thinking about what this role might be in the landscape, what purpose can it serve, what value can it bring to the members. So in March, we went to a members vote, and members pretty unanimously approved, with, for the sake of numbers, about 80+% of members voting, about 90% saying yes, they approved the proposals. So this is what I'll get to next in terms of what changes and what stays the same. But this should very much be seen as an evolution of the NZBA, not a revolution. So in terms of what changes and what stays the same, I should also introduce and caveat that by saying that there are many little words that change in the guidance here and there. I'm not going to be going through the full detail because that would be impossible to cover in 10 minutes, let alone 3 hours or so. But when members were, providing feedback to us, these 100 or so that have already set their first round of targets, they were providing a lot of information about some of the real practical challenges they were having to operationalize elements of the guidelines, in part due at times to technical constraints like data availability in some sectors, but also because of the limited progress in many sectors, the real economy, and needs to align with jurisdiction-specific regulation, policies, politics. So there was this kind of call, and I think probably a fair call, to introduce flexibility to member requirements. I have to caveat, this is not about loosening the overall ambition, which remains net zero, but providing pragmatic adaptations to reflect regional progress, country-specific policies, and just make this, I guess, operationable, if that's a word, and workable for the members. So there are some elements which, so from a purely I guess, governance perspective, there's now a signatory statement rather than a commitment statement. There's now guidance for climate target setting rather than guidelines for climate target setting. There's a few changes in that way, but the guiding star, it does remain, 1.5. Whereas but where, and I should say that where there are regional and country specific requirements, which are 1.5. So for argument's sake, from a European perspective, there's an expectation that that's the level of ambition which banks will be aligning with because it's reflecting the real economy. There are some things which are staying the same very much as before. Members are still expected to set and publish individual science-based targets within the first round within 18 months, and members who have already published the targets, they're not expected to go back and change them. But the bit where there is more flexibility, because it's the bit that has been picked up, of course, when people are talking about moving away from 1.5, it isn't. I mean, it is and it isn't. So the previous point, the guiding star remains 1.5, but we do have to account, for regional progress, and therefore allow in some regions where the economy and politics isn't moving to 1.5 in the short and medium term, some I guess ability to just be practical and to use pathways which are in line with the Paris Agreement, which is of course well below 2 degrees, but not the previous, I guess, structured element we had where we talked about 1.5 low or no overshoot, I guess, requirements in the guidelines. Again, this is all about practicability and operationalization of it. Strategically, and this is a key point, the Alliance now has a strong focus on real economy policy engagement, which is something that we didn't do much on for the first few years. This makes sense. I think, I was talking about it with colleagues just yesterday. I don't know if you'd asked us 4 years ago, we wouldn't necessarily have mapped out that we were doing these different phases, but with the benefit of hindsight, this makes a lot of sense. The first few years, it was about creating this framework, this common understanding of how to approach target setting. And now, as the largest global initiative, which is specifically focused on supporting climate mitigation action by banks, we realized that we're uniquely positioned to build momentum and to actually, through leadership, essentially, I guess, send messages to the market and to policymakers about what may be needed to actually make the net zero transition bankable for the banks. So there's 3 dimensions of work for the Alliance: leadership, capacity development, and I guess our technical climate framework. In terms of the topic for today and this webinar, the Alliance still has its guidance and its previously published sector works. It's currently working on 5 other sectors where technical documents will be published later this year: agri, aviation, cement, coal, and shipping. And it continues its member-led research on transition planning and transition finance considerations. But and just in terms of there's just a few numbers there, but it's just to show there's a lot of work which is ongoing. 7 thematic working groups, various capacity building initiatives, 50+ banks are involved actively in these different areas. But the 2 big areas of work which I want to flag, as I've sort of implied to date, banks, they can only achieve their targets if the real economy evolves too, which I think we all know that. That's the sectors that they're financing, the real world. And this depends on company-led progress, which in turn depends on policies, regulations, incentives, barriers, etc. So the Alliance, it's going to be working this year quite strongly on building a stronger, a bigger voice, engaging with these key stakeholders to highlight ways, as I just said, to make the net zero commitments and targets bankable. And that's a real key point. So sector by sector, where the NZBA will be engaging with policymakers, not all policymakers in the world, of course, but it's going to be focused on certain sectors and certain regions, depending on where we think there's actually a value that the Alliance can add in terms of voice. The second area, which is very relevant to the discussion today, we're looking at is more technical. And essentially, it's looking at complementary metrics to emissions-based metrics. When the Alliance was launched, it made a lot of sense to focus on absolute or intensity-based metrics. In many ways, it still does. There are frameworks and methodologies out there which people use, and it's comparable. There are gaps too, I recognize that. But in the case of financial institutions or banks specifically, it may not be enough in itself in terms of steering the portfolio and managing risks and having impact. As I said, banks are very much dependent on other actors in their ability to meet their targets. So they, of course, they do have an ability to steer to influence, but there's only so much they can do in terms of actual emissions if no one else is making the progress. So the net zero targets and commitments they're making, it is of course, you know, about the metrics, the emissions-based metrics, but it is, you know, possibly, you know, it goes beyond that. So it's also about financing, you know, for instance, maybe in absolute financial terms, maybe in terms of financing a general technology, which is better, in inverted commas, in terms of emissions than an alternative. Maybe it's also and I'm using these terms in inverted commas, maybe it's about supporting a worse company in terms of emissions than your average portfolio emissions, but bringing it in line with the rest, thereby achieving an actual impact in the market. But if you do that, well, your average emissions are going to go up in the short term, maybe in the next few years. So how do you I guess, close the circle on that? How do you make it workable? Because you'll be further away from what your target is, but actually you're having an impact. So there's no clear answer. It's complicated and it's sensitive in many regions for a number of reasons. Personally, and it's just a personal view, I think it will probably be a mixture of metrics that we're going to need, as no single one is ever going to provide the full answer to a very complicated picture, and some sort of dashboard may be required. That's just my view, not the alliances, and it somewhat matches what Julie was saying about the multifaceted approach. But that is work that we're doing work on this year. We're not publishing any I'm going to call them, you know, formal guidance in any kind of way on it. But for the next was it now May? So the next 7 months, this complementary metrics, I mean, we have a different term internally for it, but essentially this complementary metrics area, we'll be looking at that, and then we'll be publishing technical notes and analysis and research to show what the members are doing, and also to show, I guess, our reflections on what we think is very relevant and usable by the members. I think my time is up, but I think we'll be doing questions at the end. So back to you, Stefan.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was awesome. And yes, we'll come back to the policymakers afterwards with Raphael. But you mentioned financing is key, and now I would like to give the floor to Valerio and Michael from the CPI Climate Policy Initiative. Has been basically probably the first organization, very pioneer in tracking the green financial flows globally for I guess over 8 or 10 years almost now. So what's the situation now, and what's your take on this, and basically on all your efforts to provide consolidated metrics to everybody, basically, and very, very useful work that you're providing at CPI.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stefan, for the invitation and for giving me the opportunity to review the interesting report that also Julie presented before. I'm Valerio Michele, and I'm Associate Director at the Climate Policy Initiative, leading our work on the Net Zero Finance Tracker. As we know, and it's also Simon mentioned just before me, alliances be contributed significantly to improved commitments, but also disclosure of data in the past years. But as we know, they recently reprioritized these efforts. What does it mean in practice for non-profits or organizations involved in the data production? And this is the agenda I'm going to go through. First of all, it calls for the importance of independent data aggregation and consolidation. Alliances still play key roles in driving meaningful action in the financial sector. However, independent research organizations can step up further to track response and ensure consolidation and standardization of data in a way that is most useful to inform policymakers and that can be trusted as independent and comparable. Second, it calls for a focus on deployment of capital in clean solutions, as coalitions refocus on mobilization of capital towards the transition. There is an opportunity for independent data to increasingly track deployment of such capital to both low carbon and high emission activities. And I will try to cover what CPI is doing for both of these 2 points in this agenda, focusing in particular on our work on the capital flows. On the first point on independent data aggregation and consolidation, what we are trying to do at CPI since 2021 is providing a platform, the Net Zero Finance Tracker, that comprehensively assesses net zero response and impacts by key financial institutions. The goal is to primarily inform policymakers, civil society, and financial institutions about the status of the net zero progress and where the main gaps in actions are. Information in the tracker is also useful to inform investors, but other platforms like Transition Arc are delivering on this more specific focus and use case. The current version we have covers 1,000 financial institutions with datasets from 50 data providers and analysis of direct reports for more than 100 institutions. So how do we measure progress? We've measured progress so far. So we do it by aggregating, standardizing, and benchmarking data so far from more than 50 data providers, including CDP, Asset Impact, PRI, and many others. And these are the main data providers we include now. And this is the full list. Our key goals is to ensure comprehensiveness in the coverage of actions by financial institutions by relying on multiple sources. Action is standardized into more than 80 standard actions and benchmarked against requirement existing from existing net zero frameworks and guidelines. And this is the list of those that have been used at the end of last year, and we're currently updating this part of the work. Benchmarks are also used to score the level of response for the set of indicators. Currently, we are using 17. Simon mentioned the importance to measure more than one indicator of progress. We have 17 across 3 dimensions: targets, implementation, and impacts. And also, these are currently under review and expanded. But at the moment, under target, we cover, for example, mitigation investment goals, as well as fossil fuel phase-out goals. Under implementation, we capture disclosure systems for emissions, investment and risk management, engagement metrics, and others. And on the impact side, we are looking into real economy metrics primarily. The first 2 dimensions are measured for their credibility, so measuring whether indicators meet the requirements from the zero framework guidelines that I just mentioned. Here, what we do, we display the distribution of scores over time, but this year we plan to also display standard actions that are driving such a score, while on the impact dimension on the right side, focus instead on impact indicators as they are. So we show metrics of progress as it is. Transparency is in the center of this work, and we accompany our dashboard with the detailed methodology documentation that I invite you to consult if interested. So moving towards the deployment of capital in clean solutions, we have seen that this is being key new focus of action, particularly for coalitions. On the flows, our key work remains the landscape. That's what Stefan mentioned at the beginning. We are doing this since 2012. This has been the most comprehensive assessment of climate finance flows, which we break down by actor types, instruments, recipient, and uses of finance. The work feeds into high-profile publications like UNFCCC, Banner Assessment Report, and Progress Report for IRENA and IDFC. The one you see in the slide is a flow diagram summarizing the main output of our core tracking work, which focuses on global data, but there is much more we do in this space. For example, we also feed into specific deep dives that focus on specific sectors, like agri-food system or renewable energy, or specific regions or countries. We also released an Africa landscape, for example. So this is what we cover on flows, but how do we interpret the trends that we are tracking over time? So are we going the right speed? And is where our work on needs and the roadmap steps in. So our work on needs basically tries to address the questions such as how far are we to closing the climate investment gap, and which regions and sectors are the largest gaps. We collect and process comprehensive data on 2 types of complementary needs. The top-down needs, basically, what we do here is the estimated climate finance required across different sectors to keep the average global temperature rise within the 1.5 degrees Celsius. The needs are typically derived using predictive models developed by different institutions, and they can differ widely in the data assumption geographical scope. While bottom-up needs are the climate finance required by countries to reach their national climate targets under the NDCs. So that's an overview of the sources we use so far for our top-down approach, which relies on over 55 reports and publications and prioritizes the most recent data and most granular data. This is instead an example of the sources used in our bottom-up work based on the review of 168 available NDCs, and also here prioritizing most recent, more granular data and covering both the finance required to be raised domestically and the finance support required from international public and private sources. This slide shows an example of how this information is used. showing the comparison between trends and investment needs. And for this year, we are planning to update both data sets to capture most recent data sources, for example, new or updated NDCs, as well as updated scenarios from IEA and BNF. So this is how we measure investment gap. To close it, however, we need to make sure the capital is deployed effectively and to the right markets. And the work CPI is doing on roadmap answer to these questions: what type of investors are best placed to fill which gaps, and what is the role of public, private, domestic, international finance in different regions. We published the methodology last year, and the approach basically follows 7 steps here. We first identify the financing gaps for a specific country sectoral scope. Then we assess investment risk and attributes for the scope identified, as well as the investor characteristics and preferences. We then see how the two match and compare the outcome with what is theoretically needed in a Paris-aligned capital mix for that country sectoral scope. And this helps highlight gaps for specific actors or capital types, or barriers that need to be addressed. And the output of this work is then the basically development of the roadmap to scale up such financing for the country and sector in scope. So depending on the scope and depth of the analysis we're doing, roadmaps can be used by different types of stakeholders. For example, they can provide policymakers and regulators with a clear or actionable set of interventions to attract the right type of capital, or help them develop investment plans for the NDCs. As mentioned, we developed this approach last year, and we are now testing it. For example, for livestock production in Latin America and the Caribbean, or looking into the equity funding gap in emerging economies. These are 2 works that are currently ongoing. Now, this is what we are doing at the aggregate level. Our work with flows, needs, and roadmaps primarily focus on real economy flows that look into direct financing of climate solutions, mostly project-level financing. However, how do you translate this into transparent metrics for individual financial institutions? And this is what we're trying to address as part, again, of our work on the Net Zero Finance Tracker, where we focus on individual institutions alignment. And it requires mainly 2 elements going beyond direct financing, and also finding appropriate benchmarks at the entity level. So on the need to go beyond the direct financing at the project level, one of the approaches we developed in 2024 was a methodology that better links the real economy data, for example, project level financing, with broader financial system by looking into debt and equity ownership structure to attribute the responsibility of investment happening on the ground. This allows to go beyond the direct financing of projects and shed light also on actors that provide capital at the corporate level, like shareholders or corporate lenders, that in turn is invested into such projects. And the graph on the right is based on data from the Net Zero Tracker from last year, and showing, for example, that while banks are the main direct financiers of power sector projects, asset managers are indirectly enabling most of this investment as shareholder or corporate lenders. And we want to keep monitoring this indicator over time, as this allows to have real economy indicators that work for a broader share of the financial system and can help us answer to questions like, are financial institutions delivering on their engagement as shareholder, or are they adopting the appropriate due diligence on their corporate lending activities? The other important aspect to consider is benchmarks that work at entity level. So how do you translate these aggregate benchmarks into entity level benchmarks? And here at CPI, we tested mainly 2 approaches, looking into low carbon and high emission side of capital deployment in a specific sector. So in the first one, which is illustrated in this slide, CPI established emission intensity benchmark of new investments, as opposed to the emission intensity of our already existing portfolio of assets. And the approach was tested both for the power sector, in part for the transport sector. It used regional data from IEA scenarios and required the recalculation of carbon intensity rates specifically for new investment in a way that factors in both existing carbon budgets, but also emissions that are already locked into the system or sectors from, for example, existing portfolio of assets. Since the paper, there has been a lot of progress on alignment benchmark, particularly on power sector alignment. As a result, The investment benchmark that we are planning to adopt this year in the Net Zero Finance Tracker for the power sector is inspired by primarily the ratio work that BNF has developed in the past years. For our NZ3, we're planning to use primarily NGFS data, which already calculates investment requirements for low carbon and high carbon technologies. CPI will then have to align the taxonomy use for NGFS scenarios with the taxonomy we are developing on flows, which also includes the definition of transition funds. So that's a very quick, sorry for this, overview of what we are doing in the space. And hopefully this is helpful, and happy to answer to any questions later on. Thanks again.
Thank you, Valerio, for all of this very useful information. And I think all can be found on the CPI website, which is very, very useful and very complete. Let's move to the OECD, Raphael. I think, as we can see, the investment gap is still very, very to close. It's very large. And Simon mentioned, basically the NZBA disclaimers about, the need to get public policies momentum, going into the right direction for everyone to meet their targets. So at the OECD, you've been leading some very important work on basically promoting the need to progress and to advocate on important, standardization methodologies, etc. And specifically, on the subject of collective alignment. So now the floor is yours to get your views.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan. Can you hear me well and see my screen?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for inviting us, and just to flag that we've been following the work of that you've been doing. You've mentioned the two alignment cookbooks reports that you have worked on together with Julie and so on, and those are things that we think have moved the needle quite a lot and have gone into the type of depth that was needed. So very glad to see the overall conclusions that you're reaching and that Julie presented earlier on. I will try to reflect, being at the OECD and where we by default take a very aggregate perspective on an international comparative perspective. I'll try to, building on indeed the work that we do on alignment assessments with, of course, the aim of informing policy making. I'll try to reflect a bit on the aggregation sort of question that Julie posed a bit in the opening presentation. The first thing perhaps I wanted to mention in opening is that when we think about assessments of progress and helping to inform decisions, we'll need to be actually quite clear about the scope of the goals that we are referring to. You've got Article 2.1c, which is the topic of today, the broad question of alignment and consistency of finance with the Paris Agreement. There are obviously other, well-known climate finance goals, the historical 100 billion goal and the new climate finance goal that was agreed at COP last year. I mentioned them because there is sometimes confusion about what is being referred to and who should take action on what. And I just wanted to flag that it's quite important when we discuss assessments that we're quite clear what we're trying to assess and for what purpose. So just reflecting on some of the terms that have been used so far by Julie, Simon and Valerio. When we think about the 100 billion goal and the NCQG, we are talking about investments in climate solutions, specifically in developing countries, which is a quite narrower scope than the broad alignment perspective that we're focusing on today. Obviously, with the concentric circle perspective that I'm showing here, implying that those two goals fall under the broader sort of like alignment question, or the other way around, that alignment can in turn also, of course, contribute to meeting the narrower, let's say, climate finance goals. Just to flag, so going into the alignment, the consistency questions very briefly. I think it's hopefully clear to everybody here that we're talking about a systemic goal that captures all types of financing, domestic, international, flows and stocks, public, private. That is all clear. The layers of finance, little visual here that I'm referring to is very much at the heart of the aggregation discussion that we're talking about, because when we think alignment, we can talk real economy investment, as Valerio hinted on, with some of these sort of like visualization there. We can talk at the level of individual financial assets and portfolios, financial institutions, which I think, Julie very much touched on, and that was the topic for Simon as well. But then at the end point, financial jurisdictions, that's where the OECD sort of tries to look at things as well, and comparison across the board. And that brings a lot of complexity. Very important, of course, when we talk alignment, we don't just talk about climate solutions and climate solutions, but very much into what's currently undermining climate goals and the whole topic of transition, of course, as Julie sort of introduced already. So with that in mind, I'll just show you 3 core findings of our work so far on these issues, and then wrap that up and with concluding remarks on the topic of aggregation. The first question that we try to answer is, how is climate alignment of finance assessed? So very much in line with what Julie was talking about earlier on. And here, looking back, what can be observed, and I think it's consistent with what Julie was referring to, is that when you look at single metrics, you get a bit lost because you get different answers. So on an alignment metrics here, looking at the listed corporate equity asset class, you get different answers from different providers, sometimes justified by different assumptions or different scopes, but quite confusing in the broad domain, and then lending itself potentially to cherry picking, greenwashing, and so on. And so I think we've heard from Julie, from Simon and Valerio, the issue or how to deal with that, with using multiple metrics moving forward, along with transition plan metrics and so on. This is something that we're fully in line with, and we think can help greatly help assess progress credibly and help address issues relating to greenwashing. So that was the first point. The second point, when being the OECD, obviously, we try to look at the aggregate perspective in terms of, where the financial system is at in terms of flows and stocks. And what I show you here is based on trying to aggregate things up per asset class, per financial asset class, what we know, don't know. Clearly, there's a lot of blind spots in what I'm showing here across different financial asset class. There's also quite strong indication of relatively low degree of alignment to date, but clearly there's a lot more work to be done in order for us to have a more complete picture. And I think the work that CPI is doing, and that Valerio, the very comprehensive work that he presented, can help a great deal in that regard, and that we can, hopefully build on that as well when it comes to the work by official institutions such as the OECD. Third question that is perhaps a bit outside the scope of our topic today, but I think is very important when we talk about the level at which we want, metrics and assessments. Is the topic of climate-related financial sector policies that typically central banks or financial regulators put in place. Here, what we've observed is that these have, quadrupled since the Paris Agreement. This is great. Obviously, driven by financial stability and inflation price-related perspectives, but posing the question of their potential contribution to the topic of climate action and alignment as well. And there, clearly, we lack evidence. Are there trade-offs? Are there, mutually reinforcing benefits between financial stability objectives and climate objectives? Those are questions that we don't have answers on. But how I wanted to link it back to the aggregation perspective is that individual financial sector policies address different types of financial institutions, work differently in different jurisdictions, and that's where we have to be careful about the level at which we aggregate, if we want the aggregate assessments to be informing financial sector policy making and policy making more generally. This is something we have to keep in mind to make sure that the level at which the assessment is conducted matches the level at which the policymakers are looking at this and the types of factors that they are looking at influencing. And so concluding remarks, bringing back to I think, Julie's presentation at the beginning, 2 points and words of cautious on aggregation, in the sense that our work so far has shown that aggregating results within an individual financial asset class, aggregating results across individual assets requires weighing contributions. And that means that you're actually under that, you're dealing with different real economy sectors and different geographies. I think Simon mentioned sensitivities in different geographies. I think that's what I'm implicitly touching on here as well when it comes to geographies. But obviously, economic sectors, real economy economic sectors behave differently and have different characteristics, which means when you aggregate that, you tend to hide that. So aggregation adds complexity and reduces transparency. Not to say we shouldn't go there, but we have to embrace those two issues. The second point we've learned is that aggregation across financial asset classes, when you want to look at the portfolio an investor or a financial institution brings actually even more challenging issues, because obviously trying to aggregate corporates and sovereigns is methodologically actually problematic in many instances. And that's where we see a lot of efforts being done perhaps on the aggregation per asset class, which I think is very interesting as well when it comes to policy making, because that's probably what policymakers are thinking about at the level at which they're entering the system. A bit positive words to end is that I think along the lines of what's been said so far, there's a whole now, sort of dynamic around identifying core sets of complementary and credible metrics that can help deal with the complexity and ensure transparency, which, again, we're fully on board with. And second, we also see quite a lot of activity at the level of financial jurisdictions by central banks, but also in the context of the system of national accounts, which at that level have the perspective of not necessarily coming with single metrics, but really combining the perspectives across the layers that we need to look at, from the real economy to the financial asset classes to the institutions, with a wealth of data that can help inform different metrics for different purposes. I'll stop there, Stéphane. There's plenty more that could be said, but hopefully we can get to it in the discussion.
Thank you, Raphael. That was very, very interesting, and we are looking forward to the work of the ECD in that direction. Very important. To close up this session, we're very happy to have Sagarika, chartered from an important initiative. I'm sure you can tell us more about this high-level climate champion initiative. I think this is interesting. Also, as it says in the title of this webinar, we're 10 years after the Paris Agreement. As I say, we stand firmly behind it in our research, but the real economy is there. And if you can tell us a bit more on the road to the COP30 Belém, and where all this stands in terms of, Raphael touched upon, and many of the speakers touched upon the importance of the regional level, of the geographical level. I think it's very important also in your work, Sagarika. And so where are we going in COP30, Sagarika? And
wonderful,
give us some hope, please.
Fantastic. Hope, the mysterious hope question. Okay, so firstly, thank you so much, Stéphane and Julie, the Institute, ADEME, Climate Arc and Scientific Portfolio for this excellent report. I'm going to cover 4 areas. One is the Paris Agreement, and as Stéphane asked, a bit on where we are on that. The second is my initial evaluation of the report that's just been published by Julie and Stéphane. Thirdly, the transition. Where are we overall? And what does this mean for you in the finance sector? And then finally, what to expect at COP30. Just a tiny bit about my role. So the Climate Champions role and our very small organization of about 70 people was created by the parties to the Paris Agreement and France's Laurence Toubiana, with the aim that there would be a bridge between governments and everyone that isn't a government, the whole of society, the whole of economy, including the private sector and finance. Why? Because at the end of the day, everyone needs to work together to create the change that is much needed. I won't go into the practicalities of what our organization does, but I'll just put a few links into the chat so that if you want to find out more, you can. Or maybe we'll send them around later. So just on the Paris Agreement, everyone on the line knows this. But as Simon Steele has said, no matter what you think about it, no matter whether you're hopeful, you're cynical, you're neutral, it is the only life raft that we have 10 years on after it was agreed by nearly 200 governments. Where are we on the science? Again, you know this. So in 2024, the monthly average temperature exceeded 1.5. So no matter where you think we're going, whether it's we've overshot 1.5, whether it's 2, whether it's 3, whether it's 4. The fact is this is a material and increasingly uninsurable risk. And just getting back to the foundations of what investors and finance are around, we're about risk, we're about opportunities, we're about our fiduciary obligations. And for these reasons, the science and your view on it really matters. Then where are we on the governments? Again, you know this. So the US is out. Who's in? China, the EU, India, many more. And then as I look back on finance over the last 10 years, I'm not a specialist in terms of the history of climate finance, but if I just think about private finance in my own humble efforts, back in my old job at PRI, we started with the Montreal Carbon Pledge. It rightly had some criticism, a very blunt tool, portfolio carbon footprinting. We then had CA100 Plus, which was spearheaded by CalPERS and many others. We then moved from this approach of portfolio emissions to thinking about risk and TCFD, and then through to net zero and the alignment question, and looking to the horizon. In fact, for many developing countries today, the reality is some of the key topics are actually more around adaptation and also around nature. And so who was in before? From my perspective, it was a handful of investors and banks. Now we see many more in the finance sector, from commercial banks to DFIs, much more active on this, the MDBs, the insurers. We see cities engaged on finance. We see business, we see indigenous peoples asking for direct access to finance. And then just with the COPs themselves. So in Paris, it was about 25,000 people, mainly governments there, but there were private sector participants. Dubai, of course, much bigger, 100,000, and a very large representation from many in the oil and gas sector, but also from the finance sector and many other sectors. And then Azerbaijan, even with the logistical challenges and the focus on the government negotiations on finance, about 50,000 people. I'll just quickly go now to this report and my initial reflections on it and why it matters. So I think right now we have no time for having impressionistic views. And as everyone in finance does as their day job, we very much need to take an analytical, hard-headed view, look beyond the greenwash, look beyond the hype, look beyond the climate disinformation. And that's why in an age where many people are looking to AI, of course it has many benefits, or looking for summaries, they just want the executive summary. It's actually really important to read a report that Julie has done, which is 100 pages, which will force you to confront fate versus free will. And by that, I mean, are you going to be at the mercy of the media and politicians and your peers and your clients outstanding? Or actually, are you going to question your fundamental assumptions? Are you going to look at this technically and very deep? And are you going to try and shape what exactly you do over the coming 10 years, but also the coming year? So I really do encourage you to read it. For me, what stood out is some of the points around no consensus exists on how to define climate aligned. And then this question that also some of the other speakers raised around aggregating the results. What I would ask, though, in the next version of this report, or for any other researchers out there, is really to zoom in on emerging markets and developing countries. They are absolutely critical, whether you're looking at this from a risk or an opportunity mindset, and really think about net zero in the context of emerging markets and developing countries, and also bring in adaptation. For any company that's in a sector, they're looking at both of these questions together, mitigation and adaptation, not through the silos. Then just moving very quickly to where are we on the transition, and back to this question of hope. What I would say is that it's really important, again, to apply this analytical lens, looking at the policy drivers and levers. And I found some very interesting research recently by Kingsmill Bond. He's a financial analyst, many of you may know, and the recent analysis he put out went a bit deeper into the question of energy security. And just two interesting statistics. One is 74% of the world's population live in fossil fuel importing nations facing rising energy security risks. That's 74%. And then another important statistic based on Kingsmill's analysis is replacing imported fossil fuels using 3 levers, electric vehicles, heat pumps, renewables, could cut net fossil fuel imports by 70%, saving 1.3 trillion US dollars globally each year. So I see this as a strong driver in the future, but also immediately for government action. I turn next quickly to another piece of independent analysis, the Inevitable Policy Response, which the PRI initially commissioned, and they recently released some analysis. And the fundamental thesis of this research is that there will be a policy response. It's not a question of if, it's a question of how and when, and what will this mean for specific sectors, technologies, who are the winners and the losers. And they note that the US has drastically changed, as we all know, climate policy, and there could be increases in costs, as we all know, for renewable energy projects. But despite this, the European Union remains, at least for now, committed to the agenda, while China continues to position itself as a leader in renewable energy. So these are both very interesting signals for us to pursue. However, there are material headwinds. So I'd also encourage you to look at what's happening with the different net zero alliances that are within the finance sector, and what signals are they sending? What does it mean for you on this whole alignment question? A Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, which is an alliance that we have publicly supported and continue to do so at the Climate Champions, does have a statement that says recent developments in the US and different regulatory and client expectations in investors' respective jurisdictions have led to NZAM launching a review of the initiative to ensure it remains fit for purpose in the new global context. This new global context is obviously a very significant factor, and it is a headwind. Nevertheless, the counter argument is in the Race to Zero campaign that the Climate Champions launched back at COP26, it's still going. Astoundingly, there's 12,000 businesses and over 600 financial institutions. I'd also encourage you to look at the website of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. 88 members, 9.5 trillion in assets under management, 81 have set targets, an average 6% emissions reduction, and they look at absolute financed emissions for that. But what's also interesting is they've invited asset managers to share information on investment vehicles for carbon dioxide removal. And I think that is a sign of the times. Finally, Stefan, I hope I'm okay for just another minute or two on COP30. Is it okay for you?
Of course.
Great. So if I just turn to COP30, every COP matters. I wish it didn't, because then I could have a nice time at home, not having to go and creating so much greenhouse gas emissions, and I wouldn't have to answer so many challenging questions every year about what's going to happen, and is there a hotel, what's the event, where's the finance day? But the reality is this is part of the life raft of the Paris Agreement. And I think it's really important that it's in a country that is in many investment portfolios, that really understands the challenges of poverty, really understands the geopolitics that we face today on both sides of China and the US. And therefore, I'm really pleased that Ambassador André Correia de Lago, the COP30 president from Brazil, has encouraged the mutirão, or people coming together, and also has focused on the Southern Cross. So often we talk about the guiding star, the Northern Cross. What he means by the Southern Cross is that this is a COP that really has to think about developing countries. And what we expect to see and need to see is country plans covering both mitigation, NDCs, and also adaptation. And that opens the door very much, not just this year, but in future years, for the real world policy engagement that needs to happen, that Simon was talking about. Because as we all know, banks, investors, insurers absolutely rely on policy to move faster. There'll also be a return to thinking about the global stocktake from COP28, which was basically a government-run initiative to look at where are we against the Paris Agreement, what action is needed. And then finally, finance. finance will continue to be a big theme. That we expect to see a Baku Tebelem roadmap agreed by governments that looks at how we can try to advance the new collective quantified goal, but there'll also be a key role for collaboration between public and private sectors. The COP30 presidency has announced a circle of finance ministers and some focused topics. Just to give you a glimpse of what the climate champions are working on towards COP30, it will be very practical. It will look at how insurance could be used to de-risk sector transition. It will look at nature finance, and in Brazil, they have a very interesting nature finance lab that's developing new financial instruments to scale nature finance. So if you're wondering how to navigate all of this, I really do encourage you to think about how are we going to mobilize capital to the sectors and geographies that need it? What are the drivers? What are your assumptions? What are you basing your alignment perspective on? And then we do need a robust framework. Who is financing what? For what outcomes, I think, in Julie's word. So encourage you to think about what's in the report that they've published today, and also the outstanding research questions. And then finally, I'll hopefully put into the chat a nice summary of Article 2.1c from the Paris Agreement. Article 2 is the heart of the Paris Agreement, and this covers exactly what is meant by alignment, in the words of the parties to the Paris Agreement. Stefan, I hope that's been helpful to you, and apologies if I ran slightly over.
Oh, that's amazing. Very inspirational. Thank you, Sagarika. It looks like a tough agenda that you are in front of you until November. But thank you very much for these words and the kind words about the report. I don't see that many questions, but I would like first to give you the opportunity to ask each other a few questions. I will kick off by asking a question, basically on maybe two questions in one. Obviously, what we see is a shift from basically alignment metrics, which are complex. I mean, the pure alignment metrics that Raphael and Julie demonstrated again, that they were, sometimes a bit difficult to interpret and aggregate, to more, the most easier metric at the end of the day, which is, accumulating, adding euros and dollars. When it comes to mobilizing finance, it seems, pretty easy to add $1 to the other, and together with euro, yen, and whatever money you want. You see hope in this regard. I mean, CPI has been the very first one to track this investment. I mean, Raphael, you did touch upon the need to really distinguish what we're talking about when we are basically counting these euros and dollars. They don't fall into the same bucket, but it's can you get some comments on the need to go, or the beauty to go into that direction, and the hope it provides to us? And also maybe I see a question on insuring. I mean, obviously insurers are a different animal, because they don't necessarily fall in that category where we can easily aggregate euros and dollars, because as Sagarika mentioned, their mission is different. Deleverage risk, for example, etc. So happy to get comments from you guys. Simon, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that first one very quickly. I think and again, these are just my views, not the Alliance's views, but if we say look at any company and we try to assess its financial health, we don't expect one data point to give the answer to everyone, like just one metric A, B, C, D, and whatever. There's a lot of different data points which go in there. And I think when we looked at, it's a collective we, when climate was looked at initially, because knowledge levels were lower, say 10 years ago, whenever it was, there was a sort of thought that, okay, maybe emissions is enough, and this is just the metric that we need to look at. And then as time went on, we kind of realized that actually we need more metrics, but how can we kind of aggregate that into one understandable data point which people can make decisions on? And we try to kind of move forward with, that and various actors try to move forward with that approach. But now we've got to the phase where everyone naturally, I think, is realizing, I mean, I say now, it's happened for a while, but in terms of the market is evolving towards a point where everyone's saying it's just impossible and somewhat pointless to try to aggregate everything into one score, because actually it's all the detail that's beneath it which tells the true story and helps stakeholders make decisions. The challenge is getting the balance right between I guess making the process cost effective for companies to provide the right level of data, which is going to be decision useful both for their own internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. And then there's of course the frequent competing balances between policy drivers, day-to-day life, which is impacting whether it's employees, wider society, or the companies. But I think to your point about the aggregation, that's a kind of my personal view is that, of course, we can't, if we want people to be able to understand what is happening, we can't go around publishing 100-page reports of data because no one's going to read them. So you need some kind of way of bringing it, whether it's visually or conceptually, into an understandable form. But again, even when it comes down to, as the example I was using, the financial health of a company, there are a few key data points and a few ranges, so to speak, that people will look at and experts will look at and think, okay, well, actually that is okay, or this is a little bit lower, but actually because of this other point here, that makes sense in this context. And I think that's sort of the stage we're evolving towards, where that will be used. But the bit which we haven't agreed on as a entire industry is what are the ranges which are like okay in terms of measuring progress in a certain region, in a certain sector. And that's a very complex and sensitive topic, and that's, I think, what we're trying to I guess add our thoughts to the process if we can.
Thank you, Simon. I mean, we all agreed, and I think Julie has been highlighting that we do need a multi-dimensional approach for that. But at the end of the day, it's one thing to say you will pay, and quite another to actually reach for your wallet, right? So, and I think that the beauty of concentrating the shift to concentrating to free focus on mobilizing finance. Raphael or Valerio.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in quickly a bit on your question regarding the importance of looking into climate solutions. Yeah, it is an important metrics. Of course, we strongly believe that CPI investment in new projects is what ultimately changes the emission intensity patterns in the countries that are the recipient of such financing by reducing the carbon intensity. So has a natural impact in delivering the emission reduction that we all look forward. So it's a key real economy metrics, but not all financial actors are involved, particularly in the direct financing of climate solutions. They don't all share the same position, and there was mention of, for example, insurers and their role in that. And this is why I very much agree with the point of having a broader series of indicators. First of all, one thing we do is approaching develop an approach that I illustrated before that looks into the enablers of such financing as corporate lenders or shareholders into organizations that are in the first line in the real economy that are then performing these investments, so that you can bring more transparency into the responsibility behind the flows that happen at the project level. And then looking at metrics beyond this, and as I mentioned, we currently cover 17 indicators. We're expanding this, and on the impact side, on top of direct project level financing and indirectly enabled project level financing, we're also looking into portfolio emissions as a key metrics. Was mentioned also this, despite all of course the problematic into aggregating these metrics, corporate financing. So trying to also look into financing goes into the corporate before it is deployed into project level investment. And then we're also integrating this year exposure to physical climate risk, and strengthening our indicator in particular on shareholder engagement, which is not necessarily a direct impact on emission mitigation, but it's a very important proxy of what delivers metrics and the proxy of what will be then deliver emission reduction. So yeah, that's our view.
Thank you. I'd like to give a chance to provide the last word on that, and maybe also to touch upon the insurance issue, how you treat them at the OECD level.
Yeah, I'm seeing we're probably running out of time, but just to say that I fully support the sort of the evolution that Simon was talking about in approaching this, and I think that's very consistent with what Julie was talking about. The additional sort of like maybe example that I would bring to that is, in my mind, the importance of differentiating, an analysis and understanding of the actors. And I think Valérie just touched upon it, that directly finance climate action or directly finance assets that are detrimental to climate action, and what's going on upstream from that in the financial system on the secondary markets, which is very important because it can help free up resources from new investments in the real economy. But I think we're sometimes, and in the past, we've lost that granularity of analysis. And I think that's very important in turn, because the policymakers that are trying to influence the behaviors of these actors are not the same ones, and the policies are not the same ones. On insurance, I think I don't necessarily have a lot to say. I think it's in the sense that, it poses an interesting question on the physical side as well, in particular, whether through insurance are you reaching resilience, or are you just, managing risks? It's almost a bit of a philosophical question, but yeah, I would leave it at that, because I think we could talk about insurance for a whole other webinar.
Thank you, Raphael, and thank you all of you. As Sagarika said, yes, we've been really deep diving into some technicalities of his issue, but I think that's our role at the Institut Louis Bachelier. And thank you all for providing all your views and focus on these technicalities, because they do count. And I like your word, Sagarika, on getting the impressionist pictures, but we need to really focus on very much on these technicalities, and they are very important to build a robust assessment framework. This is very important. Thank you all all of you for attending and speaking at this session. There will be obviously, with your authorization, a replay of that available on the ILB and PARC website. And I wish you a very good day and a good journey until the COP30 and many other events that will come in the meantime. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.